Thank you, everybody, for being willing to listen to some thoughts around the subject, standards of the Bible. Are they out of date? So we live in a world where there are a lot of challenges, and we live in a world where there are those who will say that this book that I have in front of me, this Bible, it's actually not much to look at from the outside. No attractive cover, no appealing colors to draw you in. In fact, my Bible, it's falling to pieces. But they tell me that people who read Bibles that are falling to pieces are not falling to pieces themselves. So here then is the question. What has this book, the Bible, got to do with me in my life in the 21st century? Many would say that this book is out of touch, out of step with my life in the 21st century. And that actually it's a bit outdated and it needs to be updated. Well, that, I suppose, is what we will be considering today for a little while. And if I can get this started, it would really help. Okay, so let's start slowly. Can you give me a thumbs up? Can you see that? Yes? Right, okay, let's put it on full screen, yeah. Right, great, okay. So, standards of the Bible, are they out of date? Are God's standards in his holy word, the Bible, are these standards important in the 21st century? Or should things be changing, progressing? Well, that is something that we need to look at for a few moments. So, standards of God, and really this is it in a nutshell, I suppose. We're going to be considering the standards of God versus the standards of the world. So what really is a standard? Well, a standard, and this is the definition, a standard is a thing by which things are judged. So that is a standard. And you would measure other things against that standard. And in the world of work, in any sphere that you choose to mention, there is always a standard. There is the British kite standard for things, manufactured goods. There is a standard, a building standard. If you work in a school, there is the government standard, and they will send Ofsted in. There is, in the medical field, there is a standard that has to be adhered to and looked to above everything else. A thing by which things are judged, if it doesn't meet that standard, then it is to be rejected. So, standards of the Bible versus the standards of the world. A thing by which things are judged, a level of excellence aimed at. That's a standard, isn't it? It is a level of excellence to be striven for. And also a standard is a flag or badge on a pole. So just pigeonhole those definitions, and we'll come back to those in the course of time, please. So here then is the question, why has God set certain standards? Do I need the standards of God? Can we live without God's standards? His level of excellence aimed at. Do we really need God's standards in our lives anyway? All right, so where can we find the perfect example of the or a standard of God? So a standard then is some sort of benchmark. And once we see and understand that benchmark, well, we know where we are. We might not agree with that standard, whatever standard it might be, but we know where we are in the eyes of God. So we're going to look at a few benchmarks. We're going to look at a couple of test cases, examples in the lives of individuals in the Bible, and we can see what God is telling us in his word. Now remember, these are not my words. These examples we will look at closely are examples that God has laid out in his holy word, the Bible. Whether we accept them or not, whether we believe them or not, whether we see them as standards or not, these are God's standards. And God has laid them out on record for us. So, why has God set certain standards anyway? Do these standards tell us about what God wants? Why can't we just do our own thing? Further still, can we live without God's standards, God's level of excellence aimed at? Why can't we just do our own thing? And where can we find the perfect example of the standard of God? So, the wonderful thing about standards is that there are so many of them to choose from. That's the point, isn't it? Your standard may well be different to my standard. My standard will be possibly very different to my next door neighbor. So it's one thing to have a standard, but these standards have to be, if you pardon the expression, standardized in a sort of unifying way so that my standards become your standards and that my standards are God's standards. So we're going to look at three examples in the scriptures: Noah, Abraham, and Lot. We didn't have a reading because what I think is important is to look at these verses carefully, go straight into it, and see what the scriptures are actually saying. So if you have your Bibles with you, I would invite you to turn these references up so you know that these references are there. So Genesis chapter 6 then, and we're going in Genesis chapter 6 and the early verses in Genesis. And this is in the context of God seeing the wickedness of the world. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Now, this is God's take on looking at the world and seeing what was happening. Notice what it says, that every imagination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. That tells us a lot, doesn't it? That tells us about the heart. Because the heart of the problem is the problem of the heart. And then notice verse 6. You see what you notice when you read with care. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. Notice that. Verse 5, man's heart evil continually. God's heart, it grieved. That, I think, is the way in which the verses are showing us that there is a world of difference between the heart of God and the heart of man. Because the heart of the problem is the problem of the heart. You might make a note of it. In Jeremiah chapter 17, it says that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Now, this is not what I'm saying. It's what the scriptures are saying. Because the heart of the problem is a problem of the heart. And what that verse is showing us is that primarily then, does man really have any standards at all? There is a great gulf betwixt the heart of God and the heart of man. Because man is evil from his youth. And so God describes the days of Noah. Verse 9, Noah was a just man, perfect, an honest man. Noah walked with God. Did you notice that? Noah walked with God. Why do you walk with someone? Well, when you walk with someone, you get to know them. You get to know their feelings, their thoughts, their ambitions, their plans, their aims. Noah walked with God. It's as if it's saying to us that because Noah saw the standards of God, he wanted those standards to be in his family's life. Notice chapter 5 and verse 22, Enoch walked with God. And in case you missed the point, verse 24 of the same chapter, Enoch walked with God. So there is this something quite important about walking with God in your life. And notice how it comes. It comes in the context of what Noah saw around him. Verse 11, the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Corrupt, verse 11. Violence, verse 11. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will corrupt them with the earth. Those of you who are making notes, Revelation chapter 11, verse 18. God is saying, you've corrupted the earth, I'm going to corrupt you. I'm going to destroy the earth. Wash it clean. That then shows that Noah and his family had made a choice. Their choice was to have in their lives the standards and values of God. Notice the standards and values of the world. Corrupt, violence, filled with violence. It's no different today. The blockbuster movies, the more violent they are, the more box office receipts, you understand. Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. In other words, Jesus says that by the time he returns to this earth, and we believe one day it will be soon, the earth will still be filled with violence, just as it was in the days of Noah. Look what it says then in verse 18. Because of the wickedness of the world, I'm going to send a flood. I will establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark. I'm going to send a flood. I'm going to wash the wickedness away from the earth. Wash it clean. Wash it away. So then we begin to realize that actually standards of the Bible, standards in the life of Noah, it was a matter of life or death, wasn't it, really? If you live, if you want to survive, have my standards, because I'm going to wash away the wickedness of the world. And Noah was saved because he had adopted God's standards and God's values. Then we come across then to Genesis, further still, over a number of pages, and we read of Genesis chapter 13. And we're told of Abram and his nephew Lot. Verse 10, and Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. So he had a great many cattle, and he wanted to look after them. And he sees the plain that was well watered before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, it was a beautiful, lush, fertile plain. And Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan. And Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. And Abraham dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Do you know, the world has a strange, subtle way of changing the language for the day. It turns things around, you would notice. The modern day language is, if something's good, they say it's bad. Or if something is even really good, they say, oh, it's wicked. Or if it's even better, they say, oh, it's sick. And you see how the world, in a subtle way, uses language to deceive. Verse 13, but the men of Sodom were wicked in the truest sense of the word, and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. And then we're told then, verse 12, he pitched his tent toward the city of Sodom. In chapter 14, it gets worse. Verse 12, he's actually on the city council, it seems. And they took Lot, Abraham's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom. Notice that progression. Pitched his tent towards Sodom, chapter 14, verse 12. He's living in Sodom, who dwelt in Sodom. And then you come over then to chapter 18, chapter 19. He's dwelling in Sodom. Genesis chapter 18, prior to what happens in the life of Lot, is very helpful. We'll leave Lot for the time being in chapter 19 in Sodom. Chapter 18, Abraham has three incredible visitors, the angels. And they come and they speak to Abram. Three angels arrive at the home of Abram. And the Lord, chapter 18, verse 1, and the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. This is Abram. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, three men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran, and he offers hospitality in his home, in his tent. So three angels arrive. They sit down They have a meal. Abraham serves them. And then they all stand up to go. Two angels go on their journey. Verse 16. And the men rose up from thence and looked towards Sodom. And Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation. So one angel is detained with Abraham. And he tells him that he's going to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. Back there in Genesis chapter 6, we won't go there now, we're told that God shut the door of the ark. Enough was enough. Chapter 19 is when two angels appear. And there came two angels to Sodom at even. Notice that. Just keep that in mind. Chapter 18, three angels. One is detained. The other two continue on their journey to Sodom. And incidentally, well, we'll pigeonhole that thought. And there came two angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gates of Sodom. Notice that. Pitched his tent toward the city of Sodom. Later on, he's living in Sodom. And later on still, one would argue that he may well be in a position of authority. Well, after all, you might recall that the king of Sodom wanted to give Abraham presents for rescuing him and his household. And Abraham says, no, I don't want to shoe latch it. So maybe the king of Sodom thought, well, all right, well, I can't reward Abraham for anything. I might reward his nephew, perhaps. But notice the character of Lot, which is important to underline. And there came two angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. And Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And he said, behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and ye shall rise up early, and go on your ways. That's how I read that. Rise up early and go on your way. And they said, nay, but we will abide in the street all night. That's interesting. What was that phrase? Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So didn't they want hospitality? Why the reluctance? No, we will abide in the street all night. And he pressed upon them greatly, and they turned in unto him and entered into his house, and he did make them a feast. Unleavened bread they did eat. But before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, round both old and young, all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot, where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. Now, when you read that word know, it comes earlier on in Genesis. And Adam knew his wife. Oh, and she conceived and bare a son. That knowing had nothing to do with, how are you? A handshake, that we might know them. It is that knowing in an intimate, sexual way. And when you look at the word Sodom in the English dictionary, it tells us all we need to know about sodomy. It tells us all we need to know about their standard. Oh yes, they had an excellence, they had a standard, all right. They had a level of excellence to aim at, but their level of excellence was so far removed with the level of excellence that God would require. And Lot went out at the door unto them, notice that, and shut the door after him. Oh, that's interesting. Exactly the same phrases in Genesis chapter 6. In case those of you are making notes, so you know that it is there. Genesis and chapter 6 were told further on that God shut the door. Genesis and chapter 7, remember. Keep a marker in Genesis chapter 19 now that you've lost it. Genesis chapter 7, verse 16, and they that went in male and female of all flesh as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. God shut the door. Genesis chapter 19, he comes out and he shuts the door behind him and said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Behold, now I have two daughters which have not known man. There it is again. I have two daughters who are virgins. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you. And do you to them as is good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing, for therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. So here is the observation. It seems to me that this was the lesser of two evils. He was a man who was prepared to offer his two daughters as opposed to sending out these men. That tells us, doesn't it, a great deal about the standards involved here. It was the lesser of two evils, and Lot was prepared to do that. That tells us a lot, doesn't it, about how Lot saw and how he felt. The New Testament says that Lot vexed his righteous soul from day to day with the filthy conversation of the wicked. Oh, there's that word again. Found again in Genesis in the days of Noah. And they said, stand back. And they said again, this one fellow came into sojourn, and he will needs be a judge. Now we will deal worse with thee than with them. And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. There it is again. The door. But the men put forth their hand and pulled Lot into the house to them and shut to the door. And they smote the men that were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves to find the door. Imagine the picture. The angels yank him inside, shut the door, and they cause that these men around the house to become blind. And even in their blindness, the verse is saying that they are still scrabbling. Even in their blindness, they are scrabbling to get that door open. Find that handle, open that door, even in their blindness. And so one wonders then, is that a picture of the world at large? Even in its blindness, still wanting to fulfill their standard and their values. And the men said unto Lot, hast thou here any besides son-in-law? Oh, son-in-law. He had at least 2 daughters. 2 were virgins. Son-in-law, which means that living in Sodom are the daughters of married citizens of Sodom. And whatsoever thou hast in the city, bring them out of this place, for we will all destroy. Same word used in Genesis in the context of Noah. For I will destroy this place, because the cry of them is waxen great before the face of the Lord. And the Lord hath sent us to destroy. And Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-law, which married his daughters, and said, up, get you out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But he seemed as one that mocked. Oh, that reminds us again of the life of Noah, laughing. And that's what happens when we try and hold the standards and values of God in our lives. People mock and laugh. Noah, you're building a boat miles from water? And you say water's coming from the sky? Oh, we've never seen that before. In Genesis tells us, in those days, a mist went up from the ground and watered the face of the ground. He was persuaded of things as yet unseen. Never seen rain before, Genesis tells us. And when the morning arose, then the angels, they're now described as angels, hastened Lot, saying, arise, take thy wife and thy 2 daughters which are here. By implication, there are other daughters who are not here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. And while he lingered, he hesitated. While he lingered, the men laid hold upon his hand. That word there implies they forced him upon his hand and upon the hand of his wife and upon the hand of his 2 daughters. Just how they had yanked him back into the house, now they're yanking him. Here's a question. And while he lingered, whilst he hesitated, he knew that God was going to destroy the city, but he knew also that God wanted him to leave. It's as if he was frozen. He was caught between the 2. Why was that? You see what happens? If you stand around too long in the standards of the world, you know what happens? It paralyzes you. You can't move. You find it hard to get out. And so he's there. And then we're told they took hold of his hands and the hand of his wife, the hand of his children, daughters, leads them out. And then the city is destroyed. Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities of the plain, were destroyed. And there was a cataclysmic explosion. Lot, his 2 daughters, and his wife, and she looks back, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 6 and 7 is interesting. It says, God spared not the old world. Now notice how Peter puts the 2 accounts side by side. And spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the 8th person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow, making them an example unto those that after should love ungodly. And delivered just Lot, not Lot by himself, but upright Lot, honest Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. And we are thankful that we can read that of Lot. For that righteous man, dwelling among them, in seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. So because Lot was trying to have the standards of God in his life, it meant that he hated the standards that he saw around him, because that standard had nothing to do with God. Just how Noah saw the standards of the world round about him, he wanted the standards of God. So we said that a standard is a thing by which things are judged, a level of excellence aimed at, a flag or badge on a pole. We might think of Numbers 21, verse 6 onwards, how the people were bitten by fiery serpents. And God tells Moses to make a brass serpent and put it on a pole. And if you would look to that in faith, then you wouldn't die. That is called a standard for all to see. That's the whole idea about having a standard, is that all can see it. It is a flag or badge on a pole. And the Bible goes on to say that Jesus is our supreme standard. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so also must the Son of Man be lifted up on the cross and draw men to him. That was the standard that God had set for us to follow, for us to understand, because we are dying on our feet and we need to look to the Lord Jesus Christ in faith. Oh, the symbol is well known today in the medical field. The serpent on a pole, because it is to represent life. My wife in the field of occupational therapy, on her badge, and you see that lots, it is the same symbol of health, a serpent on a pole. It's God's standard. We have a standard bearer, the bravest of the brave. He was the one, when all fall on the battlefield, it was he who would have to hold that standard high and rally the troops around, that they would go again into battle. The standard bearer, the trailblazer, the bravest of the brave. Jesus is God's standard bearer, that we might rally around him to understand and to see and to appreciate and to live out in our lives the standards of God. A soldier who is responsible for carrying the distinctive flag, or a unit, regiment, or army, a leading figure in a cause or movement. So we said, and asked the question, standards of the Bible, are they out of date? No, but rather the standards of the world are very much out of date with God, out of date and out of touch with the things of God. So a standard is a subject to which things might be judged, a level of excellence aimed at, a flag or badge on a pole. Jesus is a level of excellence aimed at. We must judge ourselves not by other people, but against him. He's the supreme example of God's standard. So we've said, haven't we, that it is important to have the standards and values of God in our lives, as it was important in the days of Noah, in the days of Lot, and in our day also. That ultimately we cannot live without God's standards. We cannot. And God's standards are revealed to us in his holy word, the Bible, for us to read and to understand and try to live out in our lives, that we will be like Enoch and like Noah, walking with God, getting to know him, understanding his plan and his purpose, that we will not die, but we will live forever. May that day come soon. Amen.